The mayor, thank you.
Great, Whitell, thank you so much. I just wanted to say, I hope everyone had a great holiday and a happy new year. I'm just really excited to be back with you for the last 2 meetings of the Public Safety Advisory Task Force. We've got our meeting today and then our last meeting on January 27th. And just really excited to kind of get into the conversation tonight. I'm excited that we're not going to be going into breakout rooms, but we're going to be staying in the main room for the entire evening to really see if we can drill down on some, policy and procedures, questions that you have. We really wanted to create more of an open forum, given some of the comments during the last meeting, to really give everyone a chance to talk. So yeah, if you've already been contributing, we really appreciate that and want you to continue. If you haven't said as much previously in some of the larger group sessions, we would really ask to make sure that you contribute here. We want to make sure that whatever comes out of the final document that ends up going to Chief Glover and to our city manager, Andrew Ching, really does fully reflect the views and the diversity of the entire group. You were all selected because you were coming from many different backgrounds and a rich collection of experiences. And so we're just really excited to be here tonight. And I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Whitell. But once again, thank you, everyone. And just looking forward to a really thoughtful conversation tonight.
Thank you, Mayor. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward to Brianne, who has public comment to read into our meeting tonight.
Hello, everyone. There is one public comment that I will read out loud for the record. Dear Public Safety Task Force members, as you near the conclusion of your project, I would ask you to remember the importance of your task and the boldness of the mayor in bringing together this group to look at critical issues facing the basic foundation of Tempe city government. Policing has changed over the years, but its core is still how you treat the people you serve. Problems in Tempe didn't just sprout up when Antonio Arce was shot following a poor police response. It was a response reflective of a shoddy culture that had been growing for more than 10 years. This culture didn't live in a vacuum. It's been publicly discussed in the press and were presented many times to the 2 previous police chiefs, Tom Riff and Sylvia Moyer. The current city manager and former city attorney, Andrew Ching, were also fully aware of the issue, even as Mr. Ching had direct and strong influence and oversight over the police department since 2006. From Tempe's disproportionately high arrest rate of Black versus non-Blacks to the poor outcomes in sexual violence investigations involving women and children, Tempe's lack of an advocacy center for crime victims of all kinds of crime in Tempe seldom get justice. In 2019, there were over 140 sexual assaults and 2 arrests, while there were 394 marijuana possession arrests. Tempe has one of the highest crime rates in the state in Maricopa County. Tempe has serious crime problems on top of a serious policing problems. Recommendations from across the country regarding police reform center largely on training, refocusing priorities, public accountability, and transparency. Those same recommendations have been made to Tempe officials for years. For too long, Tempe police chiefs and city management have failed to lead and protect. Accountability is not just an issue at the police department, it extends to City Hall. Any organization is only as good as its leadership. Reform at the Tempe Police Department will only occur when there are serious reform for those who provide police department oversight. Otherwise, your work will become nothing more than an online PowerPoint presentation for the police chief, city manager, and elected officials to boast about and hide behind. This is from Bill Richardson, City of Tempe resident, and that concludes the public comment.
Thank you, Brianne, and I will move forward with Rosa and Chelsea for our session overview tonight.
Great, thank you, Whitell. Good evening, everyone. So glad that you're back with us, and we'll go ahead and get started. If I sound somber, it's because I wanted to share something about one of your colleagues on the task force, Sue Ringler. She has been diagnosed and she gave me permission to share with you. She will not be participating anymore on the task force. Sue's been diagnosed with lymphoma and underwent chemo in December and has 6 more treatments. So she said, please share my situation with the task force members, my colleagues, and let them know that I wish I could be there and to remember to be caring and connected. And that's all she wants for our community. So I wanted to share that with all of you. And with that, I will go ahead and get started on the session overview. So what you can expect today is I know many of you are probably elated that we don't have Miro tonight, so you're welcome, my gift to all of you. But we had made a commitment at the last meeting to stay connected with one another as we explore this session, as an opportunity to share thoughts and ideas as far as the framework and the strategic plan, as we called it before, buckets, but now they're going to become basically pillars and strategies. So what you see before you is, I want to just briefly go over the city values. I think it was Jacob who mentioned that last time, and I want to honor that request and review those with you briefly. The task force scope, remind ourselves of the reason that why we're here. The importance of the budget planning that we're in at the city of Tempe, and I won't belabor the 101 of government, but I think it's important for all of you to know the timing of our budget and how your recommendations hopefully will be reviewed and recommended in some way of supplementals for this budget cycle. So I want to share that timeline briefly with you. Wydell will then get into, she has collapsed in buckets and pillars, your information that you provided at the last meeting into basically a format that you saw in the packet that Brianne was kind enough to send to you. Along with that, additional submissions that were not discussed, whether in small groups or the larger groups, that we will take on also and review to see if you want to move those into the pillars. Our city manager, Andrew Ching, will review then the implementation process, as is very important. And I've heard from many of you, it's not just the plan, but ordering your work and how we implement that is just as important. It's the accountability. And then talk about next steps. So that's where we are tonight. Any questions regarding any of that? Okay, then we'll go ahead and get started. If you've never seen our city values, here they are. I always loved, because I have been part of the organization that I recall when diversity was added. It was one of the last values added, as we see there. So basically, we know that we put people first. That is our core value and DNA, and hence why the mayor has assembled this great group. We need to have the perspectives of various people in order to have a very solid plan. Integrity of our word, integrity of our commitment to you, that we honor your dedication to this task force, to the group, and your recommendations, and making sure that we follow through with what we say we're going to do. The respect that we show one another. And today, as we're all together for the full 3 hours, if that's how long it takes, I remind all of ourselves just to be respectful and making sure that we see participation, as the mayor said, from all sides of the perspectives, because it's important. As you all know, I work with data, and I always say, the product is only as good as the input of data and information. So 23 members, we need to make sure that we have all that input in order to have a solid plan that moving forward. The creativity, Tempe is known for being innovative and creative and solution focused. So I ask us, if we don't have those answers, that we think about creative solutions to some of the challenges we're going to discuss today. Quality product, obviously we all know that Tempe is known for producing some great things, and the openness to share, to Sue Ringler's comment as far as asking us all to be connected and caring, not just of ourselves, but of the community. So being open to each other's perspectives. And then lastly, obviously close to my heart, equity and inclusion, and diversity, as understanding the diverse perspectives of the working group. So as we see there for the task force members, we had originally, when we set to work on this in October, we identified the scope of work, which is really to build trust, accountability between the community and the police department. So I know we want to solve all the world's problems. We can see nationally what's going on in our nation that I'm sure we're all grappling with. But I ask us to, for the 3 hours, if we can at all, just stay focused on that scope, because what you're doing is really creating the roadmap for what needs to happen in the next few years for our organization. and more importantly, hopefully in this budget cycle. Next slide. So the budget cycle, strategic planning works hand in hand with our budget department. And the importance of that is because what we've transformed our organization is to be really data-driven, to not just have a strategic plan that sits on a shelf, if you've heard me say that before, but to fully operationalize it, give it life, for us to look at it continuously as an organization in all departments, and then making sure that, as I always say, you want to know the values, you know that you want to know the work or the importance of anything. Follow the money of where they place their money, and that'll tell you everything about that organization. So as we just talked about values, as we just talked about our scope, please know that the budget is very important to what you recommend. And I wanted to share with you, and you can see the details, but the budget cycle starts every July until June. So right now, we help the budget office identify priorities for the council based on that strategic planning. Now the city is looking at various departments of submitting supplementals, whether it's capital improvement, structures, or operating. How do you maintain the structures? So right now is pivotal for at the end of this month to making sure that our interim chief has your recommendations, that then he can sit down with our city manager and identify what would move forward in our budget cycle. And I share that all with you because the honoring of this work, while we'd like to have conversations ongoing, there is some timing element that I think I've shared with a few of you, but I wanted to make sure collectively that you all know the importance of this work coming to some recommendations by the end of the month. Any questions regarding that?
I think Rabbi Shapiro has his hand raised, so if you want to unmute.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether the costs associated with the implementation of these recommendations exist within the police department or elsewhere in the budget, or is it a combo?
Thank you, Rabbi. We have been in conversations just based on the conversations that you have provided or recommendations, just initial conversations. The chief has already started to look at some placeholders in the supplementals for some of the things that he's seeing that are coming out of this working group. And it's, to answer your question simply, it's both, but we can get into more details about it. But basically, the chief has already had the foresight to think about some of those placeholders, but also there is budget, some budget, not a lot of it. Our CFO would disagree with me.
But Rosa, it's Lauren. Could I just add that, Ken Jones is always fond of saying that operations drive our budget doesn't drive our operations. And so some of what we're talking about is going to be a shifting of budget depending on how we shift operations. Yes, absolutely. Strategic planning, we always ask people, we know that the service we provide in the community changes. So sometimes we have to what we call repurpose. We're asking as people submit their supplemental and we create acceleration models of things that we want to see, better pavement, better parks conditions, that we look at first, how do we repurpose some of that funding? Are there opportunities to reallocate? Or then it's supplemental. So absolutely correct, Councilmember Kuby. Wydell, I think that's what I have.
Great. Okay, so moving us into strategic planning and our discussion for this evening. First of all, it's good to see everybody again. Thank you for doing your sound checks. I did want to share with you, since we do have such a large group and we're not breaking into small groups tonight, a couple things that I'd like to ask of you. One of them is that if you would like to speak, if you could raise your hand. That way we can make sure that everybody in our group can be heard that wishes to speak. And then after you've raised your hand, I will lower your hand so that we'll know who is the next person. So it's kind of like what we were all taught in school. We're going to take turns. So on your screen here, in one version of Zoom, you can go into your participants list and raise your hand as it shows there on the right-hand side with the arrow. Or in the lower box, if you have an updated version of Zoom, you go into reactions and then you can raise your hand there. And so it depends on your version of Zoom on which way you would like to raise your hand. But we'd ask that everybody do that so that we can again honor everyone who wishes to speak. And make sure that we're, moving forward with our planning processes this evening. So with that, in your pre-work, we had organized your ideas and your actions that you had discussed in your small groups. If you remember, we went from our small group and we brought it out to our larger group. And so what I've taken the liberty of doing, so all mistakes are mine, is to put in a framework for you. I kind of tell people it's like building a house. You first have to have that framework and structure before you can start putting all the other things inside it, or covering it with a roof, or doing walls. So what I wanted to check in with you is that these are items that came from you, but created a framework based on similar actions, related ideas, and themes. And so I wanted to ask with you about what about the headers make sense to you? And which ones might be on point and which ones might need to be amended? So if you have any comments on that, if you could please raise your hand. So we have police model and accountability as one of our pillars, data and transparency, community engagement, as well as workforce culture and wellness. So I'm not seeing any hands on that. Seems like for 2020, I might have, I think, Lauren, you have your hand up, please.
Sure. I want to know whether community engagement would include how police and Tempe engage with the community during a protest. If there are some overriding principles or practices. I know that, there's different organizations that have sort of model language, but I wonder if we touched on that, that should be in there.
I don't think we touched on it directly from the meeting on the 21st. I do know that it's been part of our discussions, and we will have an opportunity this evening to add anything that may help us complete a more robust plan. Okay. So, and then Keisha, you had your hand up. Oh, bad timing, huh?
Yeah, I just took a bite. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing that I noticed that jumps out to me, are we picking any one of these, or are we just specifically talking about police and modeling for right now?
I'm just talking about the headers that are in the colored boxes. Is there anything that might need to be amended or refined of those headers?
Yeah, so under community engagement, number 7, we called for a proposal, or in our homework,
okay,
to the criminalization of homelessness, which would mean to stop citing houseless folks for minor things like
okay,
jaywalking, public urination, stuff like that. And in here,
okay.
it sounds like you guys adopted that, but with the caveat that, oh, you can still cite them, but as long as you educate them first, which, that's still
so just, yeah, so this came from one of the other breakout groups that you weren't in on the 21st. And it is different than what your, the subsection of the group submitted in the submissions, but we will be seeing that a little bit later. So I was really just asking more about the headers as far as the titles of each column, if those make sense to everybody.
Okay, sorry about that. I jumped ahead.
That's okay. No, I appreciate your participating. Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna lower your hand. And then, so we've got the framework. And again, these were items that were moved from the small group that everyone wanted to see in the larger group, and also part of the plan. So it seemed like we had a general support around that. So with that, I want to start moving into each of the pillars and talk about those in regards to what's most essential, what needs to stay to move forward with our plan, and what would you be supportive of if it were to be changed or revised by the group tonight. So I'm going to move to our next slide. And on the left-hand side is our police model and accountability. And that is the same items that you just saw in the larger framework. It's just been kind of pulled out for you so that we can focus our attention for a brief moment here, or for some amount of time, in regards to the model. On the right-hand side, you'll see notes that Elisa and Janae will be keeping. We have kind of a backup note taker as well. And what I'd like to know is there anything on here that seems most essential in building our plan in regards to the police model and accountability?
Yes.
Okay, Dr. Robbie has her hand up. And John, are you able to raise your hand in the chat or on Zoom? Okay, Robbie, if it's okay, I'm going to go ahead and start with John. He had his physical hand up, and I'll try to watch for that as well. Oops. Did we lose John?
Okay. I had a concern about this when we were speaking about it originally, and I have an ongoing concern about it. And I spoke with a nephew who is a sergeant in the police force in Tucson in regards to create an unarmed unit that responds to nonviolent crimes. So I said to him, do you do such a thing? And he said, we would never do such a thing because you never know who else might be there and who might be armed and what kind of danger you might be walking into. So I still have a problem with that. I don't think it's a particularly great idea.
Okay. And other
I'd like to know what Chief Glover thinks about that.
Chief?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, John. Well, in terms of unarmed response to nonviolent crimes, I mean, we do have our police aides, or what they used to be called community service officers, that will respond to certain situations that are nonviolent in nature, such as, if somebody is reporting a burglary that at their residence, but it's been a few days, we know that there's not a suspect that's there. Those are the type of situations where you have a uniform response without a gun that's present, or a traffic accident. We have those that are responding to calls, police aides that would respond to calls for service that are traffic related, to address traffic accidents and be able to take a report, something that's not violent in nature. So there is sort of a place for them, but it wouldn't be a situation where you would take a person in uniform that doesn't have a gun to a domestic violence call, which we know in policing that's probably the second call, or in terms of the hierarchy of calls that are most dangerous, is probably the second most dangerous, because they can be very emotional and volatile situations. You don't want a person to just walk into that kind of a situation without having the necessary tools or equipment to be able to deal with it. You could end up getting essentially somebody hurt or killed. So that could be problematic, and so that's what something like that is what we would want to avoid.
Thank you, Chief. Dr. Robbie, and then we'll move to Keisha, and then Mayor, will have you go after Keisha, or actually, sorry, after Rob Ferraro. Sorry about that. So Robbie?
Good evening. Hi, everybody. I had a question actually earlier about the headings, because one of the things, and I don't know if anybody here is representing any of the Tempe schools, but I think a big piece that's missing is the Tempe school districts. And so does Tempe schools fit under the heading of community? So should it be school and community involvement, or like where do the schools fit in this? So that was my first question. My second was kind of about what John was saying. I actually served on one of those kind of programs on the East Coast, and we actually dispatched together. We were the lead, but we were trained to assess safety. And so that's where we had backup from PD, but they weren't the lead. But there's a safety issue, and I had sent Rosa, was trying it, and they've already had a social worker stabbed to death with Seattle. So it's a scary thing to have done it, and I've been in those trenches and had multiple injuries from being the lead in mental health and children, youth response. So I want to hear and look for, and I continue to look for something where we can be safe as responders, and yet at the same time reduce the use of force. And so I don't know the answer, but I have done that job, just to share that with you. It's scary sometimes. I mean, people who are high on meth are highly dangerous. And they can be the nicest people, but the brain is getting brain cells killed when you're taking meth. And so we have to find a way to keep people safe and respond to the needs of the community. So I just wanted to put that out there. I agree with finding something, but it's a lot more challenging than you may think to find a way to respond to people. Even after 37 years of training in mental health, there's still some people that, you know, they need to come down off the substance before we can really have a communication. There are some people that are suicidal that it's really difficult to do that with. So I don't know the answer, but I do hope that there are a lot of people smarter than me here and lots of ideas that we come up with something that's a happy medium.
Thank you, Robbie, and my apologies earlier for not seeing your hand in regards to the topics. We got a lot of moving parts going on right now. Okay, Roy, please, or Keisha. I'm sorry, Keisha first, then Roy.
Yeah, so I have a couple things I would like to respond to in regards to this area here. I guess first and foremost, just as a response to the unarmed unit, you know, I understand that that is that thinking and mentality is part of the current culture of the police force, and I do also understand that, you know, sending unarmed individuals out into the community to respond to nonviolent crimes does come with an inherent risk. However, to the community, there's also an inherent risk sending out an armed officer. So finding that middle ground of so where both folks can be safe in engaging in those situations is ideal. But an unarmed unit, like I said, is part of changing the police culture that is currently in place and has been in place for several years, decades, centuries. The community, and then also the community liaison, just something that is critical to having a successful community liaison is making sure that it's completely separate of the police department altogether, because one of the things that we saw with Antonio Arce's family was that they didn't trust the community liaison because it was part of the police department. And, you know, there is a lack of trust in the community when it comes to police. So having that completely separate is going to be extremely ideal. Sorry, not community, family liaison. And then also last 2 points would be Care 7, again, is something that I understand is currently housed within the police department. And again, is an expansion of, you know, what we're trying to do in creating a new first responding unit, and should not be housed in the police department in any way. And then the last thing I see on here is I see that you guys included the Reinvestment Roundtable, which is something that BLM has been working on for a while now. And so just making sure that that remains community owned and led, that the city does not try to adopt it as their own and have control over that. This is intended for it to be community led and owned.
Okay, thank you. And then Roy?
Yes, a couple things. In regards to the officers not having weapons or a unit with no weapons, I think it's important to talk about the level of force. I think most important is we're talking about the use of lethal force, and can there be protocols established about what level of force can be deployed in given situations. I think there needs to be a complete training or a revamping of what that means. If there is someone having a psychotic episode, or if there is someone high on drugs and they're not following commands, or they become, aggressive or even physical, but they have no weapon per se, can there be a protocol to deploy less lethal munitions to control the situation? Because I would say the ultimate job is to gain control or maintain control of a situation, not take someone's life to control the situation. So I think there has to be a level of understanding and thinking when engaged in potential dangerous situations. And so even if someone has a physical encounter or confrontation, and we've seen it, I'm sorry, I hate to say, we've seen it time and time again, where people have been physical with the police and they have not used lethal force against them. I think also it's important to, I'm looking at the Reimagining 911 call center. I also want to make sure that we don't miss the marketing of the non-emergency number or the mental health crisis number. I think that's important to understand. And also the training that goes into the dispatch for 911 needs to be very extensive. And also I think I think there should be a diversity audit of the 911 dispatch department.
Okay, thank you, Roy. And we'll go to Rob, and then the mayor, and then Jacob Rayford.
Hi, thanks. Roy, I couldn't agree with you more on many of your points. I have advocated for many of the things that you just brought up. And so I think there's a lot of common ground there. I will tell you that I think a lot of, when you talk about lethal force, a lot of that comes down to training, and a lot of it comes down to confidence in your abilities when you're out on the street and you're interacting with the community, to what your confidence level is. And so a lot of that comes down to how much time can we afford to put our officers through training, whether it's defensive tactics skills, so where they can feel confident enough where they don't have to jump levels of force to ultimately gain control of the situation, because that shouldn't be that ultimate force unless that person or that individual immediately jumps to lethal force potentially against you. There should be definitely many other steps prior to getting to that point. So I agree with you wholeheartly. To the reason why I raised my hand. So A2, the initial issue I have with A2 is that it's looking backwards. We don't know, when we go into a situation, we don't know the violence potential. The only thing we can control is ourselves. And so we have no idea what that potential violence potential might be with somebody. So it's difficult to say, all nonviolent crimes are handled with a unit that doesn't have, that's not armed, because we just don't know that. And so it's hard to wrap my head around A2 when it's looking backward. It's 20/20 hindsight. Secondarily, I think it's important for this group, for the city, for the police department to leverage the resources that we currently have in this community, whether it's creating new resources through Care 7, or whether it's leveraging the county behavioral health crisis system. We have by far the most robust crisis system, and we have a great relationship with law enforcement with them. And so to your point, Roy, in terms of what do we need to, we shouldn't have to have cops on calls, because I'll be honest with you, having cops on calls that aren't either crimes or it's a behavioral health issue is not a good thing. I don't think we should be doing that. I don't think we should be advocating for it. I think we should be, and that goes back to our CIT training, where a cop recognizes it's a potentially it's not a arrestable offense, or there's no crime here, and it's a behavioral health issue, and there's no safety issue. Let's get our crisis teams in there. Let's have cops call the crisis line. If we need to have Care 7 there, let's do those things, and let's get the cops out. and the cops shouldn't be there. So I think it's just important to know that we recognize that let's leverage all of the resources that we have, because we have the best crisis system in the country. And let's make sure that we're bringing the right people to the call to serve those individuals, so we don't have to have the cops there and it doesn't have to turn in that direction. So hopefully this group can recognize that we do have those resources. Let's leverage them and let's see what fits and works best. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I'll go to the mayor and then to Jacob and then to Jeff.
I will pass and just go over to Jacob.
Okay, thank you. Jacob Rayford.
Yeah, thank y'all. Let me make sure y'all can see me here. Okay, yeah, I wanted to speak about, I guess we're speaking about the about CARE 7 and whether or not it should be completely removed from the police force. And of course, I believe it should. And I know, you know what, I know we were supposed to speak about things at the end of the PDF, but this directly relates to CARE 7 here. I honestly believe that in order for CARE 7 or other things of that nature to be fully effective and to decrease the risk of any accidental excessive force on behalf of the police department, there's no reason why there should be any sort of police dispatchment of show of force set to these situations in the first place. I had mentioned Cahoots and the Whitebirds Clinic. I know they have relationships with both the Eugene, Oregon and the Portland police and the Portland street team and whatnot. But the fact of the matter is they're a completely independent entity that is trained in mental health and crisis prevention and things of that nature. It's literally their specialty. And of course, these things they do come with inherent risks. And I feel that when it comes to things of this nature, the police department should only be referred to when things are beyond, absolutely beyond that form of control. Other than that, these are things that scenarios that these individuals are trained to deal with, levels of hostility, levels of physical threat. That is within their wheelhouse, their skill set. So I feel that more attention should be placed on making CARE 7 completely independent and not needing the police department to be called, and for instances and to remove the instance where the police department uses excessive force.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, Raquel, and then Genevieve.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick clarification as it relates to CARE 7. CARE 7 is housed under the umbrella of Human Services and as a part of the fire department. They're not a part of the police department. We do have some CARE 7 staff that is within the police department, but that is within our sex crimes unit and child crimes. So that way, when we are dealing with situations that are very graphic in nature or is very traumatic to victims, that you have the CARE 7 specialists, that clinician is right there along with the detective to be able to, provide information, to be able to provide assistance. They do a number of things for us in terms of that trauma-informed care process. And so that is the specific reason why you have CARE 7 that's embedded in a portion of the police department, but CARE 7 by and large is not a part of the police department.
Thank you, Jeff. Raquel, Genevieve, and then Robbie.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I want to just also make a comment that of some of the things that were being spoken of earlier in relationship to A2. And that is about the interpretation of threat of force or force of threat, whatever that phrasing is, that there is, that's the part I'm concerned about, is where is that going to be addressed? Because the interpretation for all of us, not just police officers, not just white police officers, but just everybody, fundamentally is connected to our interpretations and beliefs around race, gender, and class. And so I know that all of these suggestions are sort of interwoven together, and I want to make sure that I recognize these things aren't existing in a silo, I guess is my point. But I also would just love us to hear us kind of be really explicit about things that are related to race that have come up in all of these conversations that underlie this conversation, that underlie the conversation we're having this evening. And I would also just agree with my colleagues that the expansion of Care 7 should take place outside of, or should figure out a way, even that part of it, to take place outside of the police department. And I'm wondering, while we do have a lot of great social services, every time an issue comes up, that's what I hear is we have great social services more than any other city. Those services aren't working for some people. And I'm really curious about how that is being addressed and how it will be addressed in relationship to public safety. I think somebody earlier brought up the Arce family, that they did not feel comfortable with their advocate they were assigned. So what's the plan B if plan A doesn't work out? One, and where does that happen in these conversations, which are very high level, and I know not the detail of, the dotting the I's and crossing the T's that we'll get to hopefully eventually.
Genevieve and then Robbie.
Yeah, thank you. I did have a comment around the A2 stuff as well. Just I definitely hear what Rob's saying. You can't expect people to adhere to certain behaviors without training, without confidence. I definitely understand that. And assuming positive intent, we have to be mindful of that unconscious bias as well. So I think we really, that's something that we just, we can't ignore that factor. So there may be, that might move into, if that component is refined, that also needs to be added to the workforce culture bucket as well. I hope that makes sense. If we're asking people to change and be conscious of their biases, that needs to be part of accountability and workforce culture in that pillar. So that was one thing I wanted to mention. Also in relation to Care 7, the expansion of Care 7 in Section B there, to Roy's conversation earlier and what a lot of people have said about Care 7, that team is phenomenal. There are really incredible individuals on that team. And perhaps that's something we need to incorporate also with the 911 call center. So if we're reimagining the way dispatch is engaging with people who call them, perhaps that's another way to incorporate how to determine what calls require Care 7's assistance and which don't. And that's that one item, B3, reimagining the 911 call center and dispatch. I know that's a huge item, but I think that is such a entry point for a lot of activity that's going on with police. So I think that's a really important thing to focus on there. And the third comment I have is really more structural about I know you asked about the headers before, and I didn't see any challenges with it, but as we've been having this conversation, I see police model and accountability in this column here. I'm looking at the whole model on the other, on another screen. And then I see a section on accountability and workforce culture and wellness. And where my head is going with this is we've got these 4 pillars for now, which can totally change. I understand that. But accountability feels like it needs to go across all 4 pillars. There needs to be some accountability and outcome metrics, or just outcome-based accountability measures across all the pillars. So I'm not sure that it makes sense to put accountability in just one header as opposed to banding it across the whole item, the whole, all the pillars. Maybe that's part of the foundation or the roof, as you mentioned. Similarly, communication should be that. So whenever and I know that'll probably be part of the execution plan, but when it comes to making changes, recommending changes, you're not just changing a policy, you're having to change hearts and minds too. So, and you may even need to be educating the community, not just the internal city employees and police departments. You might need to be educating the community as far as you know, here's when you should be calling 911 and here's when you shouldn't, right? I think, Roy, it might have been you again that mentioned the non-emergency number, right? So there's a accountability and a communication layer, I think, that goes across all of these.
Okay.
All right, that's it for me.
Thank you. Robbie, and then I'm going to also, following Robbie, we'll have Rabbi Shapiro.
I want to echo Genevieve said, yes, accountability for all of us, every member of the Tempe community, we should all be held accountable. And I still want to put in, where do the schools fit? I don't see anything about schools here. But one of the things that we're not talking about too, and I think I was invited because I am a mental health person, is giving people medication in the field. I look for best practices all the time, not just in the US, but across the world. And the ability to have medication in the field, to be able to use other types of things in the field, whether we could use some kind of, I was watching a documentary about using ketamine for people who are highly psychotic, like the example that Keisha, I think, just put up there. We don't have those options, and looking at, can we make those available to mental health, to paramedics, and have police come in the rear if there's a safety issue to staff. And so I wanted to add that here. Why are we not using the latest kind of medical technology to respond to these situations? I want weapons to be last, not first, and only if there's a life, you know, in danger, but ideally not at all. But there are people using medication. Ketamine is one. And I don't know, Chief Glover, if that's something, or I don't think we have anybody from Fire EMS here. Are we considering that? Are we considering offering medication in the field that we could give to calm people down, that we could avoid, even with the excited delirium? And I took the excited delirium training as well. Can we give somebody some medication so we can more chemical restraints than physical restraints? So I just wanted to put that out there because we haven't talked about that, and I'm not sure why.
Okay. Thank you, Robbie. Rabbi Shapiro and then Keisha.
I would just like to bring our attention to 1B and ask for perhaps a little more language there. It's not clear to me from what's written who's being advocated for. I think there's an intention that didn't quite get translated into the language.
I'm sorry, Rabbi, can you clarify? Is it B1 or?
I'm sorry, yeah, B1.
B1,
Beta
okay.
Tempe Advocacy Center. Advocating for whom?
We have members of the group who submitted that early during our December session. Would someone like to clarify the intent of that, Rabbi? So with that, Rabbi, in my notes I had, and I can certainly correct this, creating a Tempe Advocacy Center for families and victims, and victims of families of victims and victims themselves.
Widell, this is Lauren.
Thanks, Lauren.
That was a space where people could, or those that had issues with the police, could safely express what they were experiencing without going to, because many people don't feel comfortable reporting the police to the police.
Makes perfect sense. As I read that, though, what we have written here, it could be advocating for the police or for officers. It's just not perfectly clear, and a couple words would help clarify.
I understand that. I understand.
So, Elisa, if we, sorry, go ahead, right? Sorry, go ahead, Lauren.
Lauren, our Family Justice Commission, Tempe's Family Justice Commission, has emphasized the need for a survivors advocacy center. I mean, we have to be careful using the term victim, and sometimes references survivor, but it's those that have been victims of a trauma. But we have to have survivor.
Okay. So if I could have Elisa make a note that we can look at, just so I don't forget here, changing and refining A2 as well as B1 in regards to the discussions tonight. And then I'm going to move back to Keisha. You had your hand up. and then followed by Jacob and Robbie.
Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of add on to what Robbie was saying about using alternative services or resources such as ketamine, which currently is a street drug, but could be a valuable resource in these types of calls. I know one of the things that is really good about the Cahoots model that we keep referencing is that they send out a mental health professional along with a actual health professional who does have the experience and knowledge to handle minor health situations, or who could administer this type of drug that could be helpful in de-escalating a situation, rather than sending out a police officer whose only training appears to be, you know, pull your gun and shoot, you know. And so this could be an alternative to that, and something that we look to include. And then also to talk about B1 and I guess B2 as well, creating a Tempe Survivor Advocacy Center is important to make sure that it's separate from the police department, because once someone has been victimized or brutalized by the police department, it's further traumatizing to have them then enter a police department to get the services or the help that they are seeking. And so that is another reason why it is important for that to be completely separate of the police department.
Okay, thank you. So I'm wanting to make sure that Elise is still online with us, make sure we haven't had any technical challenges. And I'd like to put in our notes that changing or refining A2, B1, and B2, if that would be helpful.
Wydell, if you come off presentation view, you'll see a lot of notes that are there.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Thank you. I'll come off of that in a moment. Let's see. There we go. Thank you very much. I was seeing a blank screen. Thank you for that. So Keisha, I'm going to lower your hand, and then we'll move to Jacob and then Robbie, followed by Shireen.
And you're referring to the other Jacob? To myself?
Jacob Moore, sorry.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I want to go back to the the comment that was made about the accountability as an overarching theme. In having done, you know, strategic planning myself, you know, visually looking at that strategic planning process, and also the comments that Rosa made about how do you create a strategic plan that has not only value, but you know, has real value, and doesn't end up as being another report that sits on the shelf and doesn't, you know, that doesn't become effective. And so thinking visually in terms of ones that I've done is really three boxes at the top, and then you've got the pillars, which we have here are the pillars. And for me, the three boxes that typically guide the strategic plan are the mission, the vision, the guiding principles, as those three boxes. And I always get confused whether mission is first or vision is first, and then which one second. But you do have your guiding principles, and those then frame, you know, your pillars. And then those pillars, you know, unfortunately, maybe kind of really try not to get too MBA around this, but the idea of strategies and then tasks. So some of these items become tasks that are pretty straightforward in terms of what you can deliver. Strategies are more strategic in terms of kind of taking on, you know, the bigger issues.
Bigger picture.
But it flows, you know, down to the steps that need to be implemented. So that issue of accountability, I think, is one of those guiding principles that really, in some ways, continues the conversation, but also informs whether it's the law enforcement or the community or community advocates or others around the idea of what are the guiding principles that drive this, so that people understand the importance of the work, or why are we here, and why is this important to the community. And so I don't want to, you know, I know that perhaps later in the process we get a chance to kind of get that set of guiding principles, but I do agree that accountability fits in all of those pillars as well. So.
Great. And just as a point of clarification, when we have our strategic plan, each strategy and action item has its own implementation or an action document with accountability measures in that. So you're spot on, Jacob. Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Robbie, and then followed by Shireen. Dr. Lerner. Robbie, I believe you're still on mute.
Sorry. I was just wanting to respond to the advocacy piece. I was clinical director of child health, if people don't know, the Maricopa County Advocacy Center for Victims of Crime. And we did partner with ASU because there's ways to get a lot more expansive services and collaborate with classes and interns and all that. But I do think we're talking about different kinds of advocacy centers. And the question is, would we want them both together? So I just wanted to suggest we spend a little bit more time on better defining the advocacy center, the suggestion made by other people, because they might not be the same and might not be best housed together. So, and I also put up a couple just examples of places using chemical restraints, just that we maybe can add that to our recommendations to at least explore it. What Tempe PD and paramedics are allowed to do and what might be considered.
Okay, thank you. And then Dr. Lerner.
Thanks. So I may be missing something, but I've been scrolling through looking at, the notes from last time. And there's a bunch of stuff that I'm not finding, like where is it that we work? And I'm thinking under the police model and accountability right now. But where is it that we're talking about the retraining for police officers in things like use of force and just if we're re-envisioning, that means they're going to have to rethink their jobs as well. And I may be missing that somewhere, but there's also the hiring issue. We talked about re-envisioning how we hire. Diversity hires. And I know we've got the mental health part, which is great on culture and wellness. Am I missing it somewhere? Are we not? Where are we talking specifically about the police and what has to happen to make all of this other things, all the other things we're talking about to make those effective? The police have to be rethinking their roles and their jobs as well. Is that somewhere that I'm?
I do believe we've touched upon it in some of the submissions, and we will have an opportunity to kind of answer that question of what's missing that we haven't merged over to the documents, because I do know that that's been part of the discussions.
Okay, so from my perspective, be under police model and accountability, because we're rethinking a police model, right? So as part of that, we have to rethink the police role. And in the materials that were sent to us, there's a number of suggestions in there. So, so maybe we rethink that particular box, or we have to add an F to that box that includes some of these things that are missing. So I just wanted to check to see if I was missing it somewhere, or if we're definitely looking at something where we're going to still be adding other F, G, whatever we need, right? Okay.
We are. No, good point. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up for this particular pillar, any more hands. So I'd like to move us to the next pillar, which is data and transparency. And with that, I will ask the same question. I do want to remind you what the question is. So on data and transparency, I'd asked the question earlier in regards to what would make you more comfortable in regards to the pillar title? Does the header make sense to you? So let's talk about that solely right now, and then we'll move on to the content of the suggestions and the action items on the left-hand side. So any comments or raised hands in regards to the pillar title? Again, I am okay. Seeing none, we'll move to the question in regards to items A and B. What's most essential, and then what would you support if it's been changed, if we were to change or refine it from these items here that again came out of your small group work? And I have Raquel's hand. So Raquel. Raquel, you're still on mute. Sorry.
Sure. I'm not sure if this is too much detail here, but I think the more explicit we can be, the better. And I don't see, unless I'm missing it, something about disaggregating the data and really understanding, you know, we can look at the geolocated dated spots for things, but I'd really like to have the information disaggregated by race and by, if possible, economic status.
Okay. Thank you. And then thank you, Raquel. Randy?
Thank you very much. I agree with Raquel. Data is so important for this effort. We're going to have to be able to clearly identify our successes and our failures and see like what tactics are working and what isn't, so we can redefine it later on. So not only does it need to be aggregated, I'd like to see it be public as well, like our OpenGov system, so that anyone can go in and pull the measurements and pull the analytics they want to pull, and then provide feedback to the council and the police force once they have that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Randy. Any other comments in regards to improving data structure, establishing meaningful performance measures?
I had my hand up. It's
All
Lauren.
right, so we'll have Keisha, then Genevieve, and then Lauren.
I'm sorry.
It's okay, Lauren. So Keisha, you're up.
So BLM has been asking for a really long time, for 5 years now, for the same data. In 2014, it came, the arrest rates, the disparities between Black and white folks came out to be worse than Ferguson, Missouri, here in Tempe. And, you know, there's a lot of outrage around that. Some people disputed the data, and yet we still haven't gotten the data. So I know that you say demographics there, but I, you know, before the Tempe Listen session, I had sat down with people in Tempe and they said that they would get me this data, and they got me the data of how many people of color are on the force, which is not what we were asking for. We were asking for the arrest rates and the racial data of who they're arresting, even if it is the case that, for example, some people get arrested and then they're let go. That data needs to be incorporated, because that means that they shouldn't have been arrested in the first place if they had nothing to charge them with. So it's really important that this data comes out. Like I said, since 2015, you know, Tempe's had this this record of, you know, having disparities worse than Ferguson, Missouri, and we still have not seen updated data 3 police chiefs later, and I don't see it really accurately reflected in this here.
Okay, thank you. Lauren, then Arlene and Betty.
Yeah, and I just want to affirm Zara's statement, and that was a commitment that the previous police chief had said she would do, and that never really happened. I just want to say in our small group, when we talked about data, that it was important not just arrest records, and this kind of reaffirms Zara's point, but it's not just citations and arrest records, it should be police stops, because that can be indicative of disparate treatment. So we have to also have stops, police stops, be part of the data collection.
Thank you. Arlene and then Betty.
I was just following up on how you asked us the question about the prioritizing of these A or B. And that's what I'm recalling, right? I'm hearing it from Keisha, I'm hearing it from Member Kuby, where the data, the ability to have the data and access the data. Okay. So I wonder if it's that we don't have it yet because maybe we're not tracking it. And let's look at those systems. So my response or suggestion is prioritize the data, period. So we have data to analyze.
Okay, thank you, Arlene. Betty and then Genevieve.
Hi, Al. Yeah, just to this, I think it's reiterating what Sarah mentioned, but I think going to the first one, I was trying to catch up as I jumped in. And looking at, you know, the first pillar, sorry, about the Family Bill of Rights and the family advocacy. And looking at the data pillars as well, I think two important pieces about those specifically are in consulting throughout the whole process with folks, right? So like for the Family Bill of Rights or for the family advocacy, like actually sitting down with families who had to navigate this process, who have outlined, right, the ways that they were mistreated and abused, to then outline whatever the Bill of Rights could look like. I know we have, you know, a draft of some of those conversations, but really engaging community. And I think through that process with data and transparency, you know, we've submitted several RFPs, not RFPs, sorry, requests, public records requests, and similar, right? Like the time to take 6 months to multiple months to access. But I think there's some of those, like what Sarah was mentioning, that are brought up constantly, that people are requesting constantly. So really talking again with community and figuring out what that process will be to make sure that the data that is made public is data that is necessary. I know that Phoenix put up an open portal of information that no one had asked for in some cases. And so now they're producing this information that is actually not telling us what we need to know. And so then, and with that, with Councilmembers QB's around collecting data with stops, I would also just add, I don't know what Tempe does to collect the immigration and like how many times in those stops they called ICE or how many times they transferred people to ICE. But that would also, I want to know that that's important for us as well.
Okay. Thanks, Biddy. And then Genevieve, and followed by Raquel.
Yeah, thank you. I want to be thoughtful about the actual level of infrastructure that's needed to do some of this stuff. So we learned that if tickets are still on a paper system, that's a pretty big change. And I know that if you were to tell an officer that, hey, you're not going to have to fill out paper tickets anymore, that sounds really great. But in reality, that's a big shift of from the way they're doing things today. So I want to be thoughtful of the cultural change management that needs to happen to do this, and the level of infrastructure that needs to be built and the costs associated with that. So that's one quick thing I wanted to be thoughtful about when it comes to data and transparency. Another thought I had was similar around this header. As we were talking through it, it feels like transparency is part of those values, those guiding principles, so that the idea of having a transparent and open data governance is so important. And who does the governance is the other piece of it. So it's one thing if your your technology experts do the data governance. It's another thing to have data governance sit with perhaps it's a commission, right? That's looking at use of force, right? Mm-hmm. It's the accountability factor in that, to make sure that, to Viri's point, that that what Viri was saying around how ensuring that the information that's needed by the community is actually what's visible, and that it's in an interactive way so that people can slice the data to find what it is they're looking for. If they're looking for data so they can decide on if they want to buy a house in a particular zip code or not, right? There's a number of different elements that this data can be useful for, and also done in coordination with departments like Human Services to see if there are areas that some proactive assistance can be done with. So I don't want to think about data and transparency as being something that can only be used by police, but it's something that can absolutely be integrated with other departments, so that hopefully in some instances we never get to the point where police have to be involved. So that would be, I know that's long-term things, but I think that's a really important part. If we're looking at how this gets invested in, it could potentially be something that's not borne entirely by police, but is something that actually would benefit the whole department. And I don't know, the last point that I have is related to the final column around culture and things like that. But the HRIS, a human resources information system, we talked about that somewhere. I know there's so much info, but to have the ability to capture disciplinary data, be able to look at that over a period of time, and then also have that information available in case a reference for police behavior, I'm assuming negative intent here, so I apologize. But if there is an officer that has a history of or a pattern of behavior, that is visible and reportable in case they're looking for similar employment elsewhere. So that's a piece of data that I don't see necessarily represented here or in that final pillar.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Genevieve. And Raquel, followed by Viri.
So this is to one of Vidi's earlier points, but around having people interviewed in terms of the process, around how people go through the process. And I just feel like how that's done and who does it is really important when they're interviewing the survivors, and that process is interviewed by survivors who are of all different backgrounds and not just one background or one class. And then the other thing is, and this is not meant to be like as a, however somebody might interpret this, but I've heard some tonight about assuming positive intent or assuming negative intent. And I just want to say, how do you track when an officer assumes negative intent? How do you assume that? And what are the actions that follow from that negative intent, or vice versa, positive intent? And so I don't think proposing things that might lift up negative intent is actually a bad thing, because it's part of the reality of the situation, that there is that, it exists.
Thank you, Raquel. Viri, followed by Roy, and then Keisha.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I don't think I see it here, is so what happens with this data, and outline, whether this is being reviewed annually, to then what's informed policies or informed training, like what is the purpose, and to have that outlined. And one thing I found out in working within Phoenix in the city and in some of their policies is that once a policy or regulation, especially a city ordinance, was in place, they're not doing reviews like ever. Like there's no schedule of like every year, every 5 years, we should review our ordinances. And so that, I think, for data, like we're collecting this data, I think to what Councilmember Keating said, to inform us, and then inform us when and how do we include a time, time periods throughout this. And I know that we're not gonna know, some things might be sooner than other, like every few months, but I think at least a minimum requirement to review and then update accordingly based on the data we find. Just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Viri. Roy, followed by Keisha.
Also think it's important to discuss, especially given the events of the past week, what is going to be done to audit the current Tempe Police Department, to make sure that there's no membership or affiliation with extremist groups, white supremacist organizations, terrorist organizations, insurrectionist organizations, whatever you want to call it. But y'all know what I'm talking about. What steps can be taken as far as data is concerned to audit the department, to make sure that the department has not been infiltrated? And if the department has been infiltrated, how does the city plan to mitigate that situation moving forward? I mean, because we know it's a clear and present threat.
Thank you, Roy. And then Keisha.
Yeah, I think this wasn't what I was going to say, but Roy brings up a good point. And has the city checked to make sure that none of their officers were involved in what happened in DC? Because I'm sure there is a critical link between if there were any officers involved in what happened in DC. They're probably also the problematic officers that we see in Tempe. And, there's probably a pretty valid link to that. So it might be a good idea to look into it, as well as within other departments within the city. But what I was going to say is just kind of expanding on the negative intent and the data collection around being arrested, the arrests that happen that are never taken or never go anywhere, people who are arrested and then released and brutalized and then released and never given a reason as to why they were arrested and or brutalized. Collecting that data of those types of arrests will also help to identify officers that do have negative intent and that do go out into the community to target Black and brown people. And so the fact that we are not collecting that data and that we don't have demographic data available for not just major crimes, but also the arrest and release and the minor citations that are happening, that demographic data is crucially important in identifying racial disparities and racial targeting happening by the Tempe Police Department.
Thank you. And so it is now 5:23. So we've gone through two of our draft pillars. And so we're going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break. We'll finish doing some notes here and we'll come back at about 5:28. Thank you again for your participation. And I do really appreciate everybody raising their hand. It really helps us move through and make sure that we are hearing from all those who want to be heard from. So thank you again for that. We'll see you in about 5. All right, welcome back. We'll see as everyone starts to join us. We'll get started here. Great, thank you for turning your cameras back on. It lets us know you're ready to begin again. Still looking for more people to come back on. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started again. So we are now moving to our community engagement pillar with that draft title. And again, the question in regards to these pillars is what's most essential and what would we be supporting if it were to be changed or refined? And then ultimately also, does the header make sense to us? So let's start with the header first. Does the header need refinement to have agreement upon it? I'm not seeing any hands or any comments on that. So we'll go ahead and move to community engagement A. We had one item from our small groups on December. Sorry, Keisha has her hand up in person. Keisha, would you like to speak, or were you just?
Yeah,
okay.
No, I couldn't find my little hand thing.
That's okay. I didn't know if you were blocking something or.
Yeah, so I think that I guess the first thing here that I would like to address is engaging with the vulnerable populations to create diverse and engaged community, spearheaded, maybe that's not the one. Maybe this isn't the right space, but
okay.
I put my hand up.
Wait, no, there's, so one of the things is,
sorry, I missed it.
We have to understand that, yes, we'd love to build trust with communities of color, but that trust isn't there yet. And so when you talk about, putting cops, line level officers in communities, especially vulnerable communities, you're talking about increasing vulnerabilities. So, I think we're putting the horse in front of the cart in front of the horse here. Like, the trust hasn't been built, and we see this often, put cops playing basketball with Black kids, and frankly, it's a bit offensive, and it doesn't really change systemic issues. And so we really need to see some of the systemic change, especially if you're going to have these line level officers with guns playing with Black kids. That puts them at risk. What if they're playing basketball and a kid accidentally falls on the cop and he feels like that he just got assaulted, right? And what does that mean to the kid? So until we address some of these systemic issues, I don't know if it's safe to be putting line level officers into the community. To me, that feels like you're creating more risk there. Another thing I wanted to bring up was number 6. This was one of our pieces about, avoiding minor citations. That's one of the issues here. It criminalizes poverty, right? So what we see then, you took half of what we said and then added avoid minor citations without accompanying education. But it doesn't change the fact if you're citing someone for public urination, when especially during COVID, there are no public restrooms, then, if you educate them, it doesn't change the fact that they didn't have access to a bathroom. And when we look at, for example, Mohammed Mohine, the Black man that was killed for trying to use a public restroom. And so, giving education but still criminalizing poverty doesn't address the issue we're trying to get at.
Yeah, also just to add to that point, criminalizing people for sleeping on bus stops and, sleeping in parks, where are they supposed to sleep when Tempe doesn't really have a great homeless shelter resource? And so educating them on resources doesn't minimize criminalization.
Thank you. Viri, followed by Jacob and Melody.
Yeah, thank you. Well, yes, echo everything that was just said is part of what I was going to say. The other piece I wanted to just mention is that community engagement as a whole is like a frustrating piece for me as I hear it in a lot of spaces, because exactly, trust has not been built. That's one piece. But the other is that there is data that shows, right, that is not actually going to reduce violence. And that is actually not, there's no, and I think that there's another thing, I guess, to task is like any of these recommendations should come with backing of data. And there's a lot of research that has gone into just community engagement practices and efforts. Those are the feel-good things, right? Those are the photo ops. It feels good for folks to have that and say, and maybe there is one relationship built or one relationship with multiple families, but that ultimately it does not reduce the likelihood of violence that from police within that neighborhood. And so wanted to just emphasize that all of these should get researched and data before, right, they get pushed forward. Because I think from what I've seen in our research is that these do not decrease violence. So that's one piece. The other that I wanted to just mention is yeah, avoid minor citations, but also I would want to know, right, why would some of those citations just not exist? We haven't done this in Tempe, but we did this within the city of Phoenix, which was, we looked at their citations that criminalize, and we found about 137 city ordinances that have larger penalties than is mandated by state law, or that have penalties on things that are not even mandated by state law. And so they further criminalized or created their own criminalization. And so, I think that there's that piece I wanted to highlight around citations and why some of these citations even exist, and how much more are we criminalizing would be a good start, but also decriminalizing as a whole versus just saying, okay, we're gonna give you a pamphlet and still cite you. And to what Sarah said, working with Muhammad's family, that, yeah, they could have cited him and he would have still been caught up in another cycle of criminalization, even if that day they would have just cited him, right? But they didn't. Muhammad ended up being killed for wanting to use a public restroom. So those are the two pieces. The last piece, well, I'll just stop there. Those are the two things I wanted to highlight.
Thanks, Viri. We'll go to Jacob Rayford, followed by Melody, and then Genevieve.
Yeah, a lot of what they had spoke about, I actually 100% of what they spoke about, I completely agree with. Things that stood out to me as well were things such as number 6, the unnecessary citations and violations for just unnecessary practical things like relieving yourself or just being a human being. People are criminalized for that. And Roy brought up a good point: is are these individuals incentivized to ticket and harass and provide what I feel is a form of economic violence against individuals for just simply being human beings? So I am not a fan of these minor citations, and not only that, but it feels almost abusive to not only criminalize these actions, but then to educate them in the process. It's like this once again, the psychological feeling of this overbearing force
And that goes back to other forms of community engagement, which I also feel is unnecessary and a form of Stockholm syndrome. We're here because of the history of disparate treatment against the Black and Brown and Indigenous community here in Tempe and Maricopa County, just in America, period. So when we see these individuals in our neighborhood, we don't see someone who is an advocate for some charitable organization. We see a literal oppressive force. So there's no way that it could be spun around to see these officers playing basketball with us, playing Among Us with our kids in the library as this attempt to do right. You would do right by not placing us in these positions to feel that we're being victimized by these organizations that's supposed to be protecting us in the first place. I don't see why community engagement is necessary when the steps to create a safer environment is not being treated with that same level of importance nationwide. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jacob. Melanie, followed by Genevieve and Lauren.
Thank you. So coincidentally, this morning, while opening my place of business, my restaurant, a woman was asleep on our patio with a collection of our patio chairs. She was asleep on top of it, and it looked like she had been there for quite a while. Many articles of her belongings were there. So this morning, it was around 6 o'clock this morning, I had opened the front door. We open at 7, and it took several attempts to wake her up vocally, and I did successfully. She saw me there. I said, you need to move along. She said, no problem. She got up right away and she moved out of the area so that we could accept customers an hour later. Now, I've been in operation for about 5 years, and so this is not terribly uncommon. It's a little bit more uncommon in our current location than our previous location off of Apache Boulevard, off of the light rail, but it does happen. And as a novice operator, my instinct would have been to call the police. I wasn't sure what the situation was when I arrived. I wasn't really sure what it would escalate to, and so that would be my instinct. And that's actually would be my recommendation for other operators at the beginning of their process when they're not certain what the confrontation might be, if any. Having operated my business now for 5 years, I realized that it's in my best interest, if there's any possible way to avoid confrontation or conflict, I will absolutely do it. But this is why I think the community engagement piece is so important. It needs to be relevant where the calls start, from business owners just like me to residents. They're picking up the phone, they're calling the police. That is where the community engagement process is so critical, because this is where the process begins. And unless we have education, whether or not that's in redirecting those phone calls to another just dispatch, whether that's having some understanding of what a non-emergency call is, which a lot of people do not know. And a lot of people consider whatever circumstance they're in, if there's fear involved with it, an emergency situation. This is why it's critical, because we all live in this community together, and the police who are being called by a business owner or by a resident are accountable to the resident, just as they are to the community member who they're being called upon. So they have to answer to both. And that's why this entire process needs to be in discussion, and why the community engagement process needs to be addressed, because there are some people who seem to be the callers and some people that seem to be the ones that are being responded to, and we all need to be in the discussion.
Thanks, Melody. We'll go to Genevieve, followed by Lauren, and then Rob.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with what Melody was saying around educating the public. So I made that comment on an earlier slide when we were talking about it before, but I mean, you just have to look at Nextdoor or one of the Facebook neighborhood pages, and you can see some of the comments that aren't that are just lacking of awareness or lacking of empathy or lacking of, you know, no, you don't have to call the cops on your neighbor who's got this. Why don't you just knock on your neighbor's door or leave them a note, right? There's a pretty significant level of, I'm gonna call it petty, I'll call it petty calls that I think happen or are discussed on social media that are, that if we educated our community more, businesses and residents and students, I think that could alleviate some of those unnecessary calls that need to go through 911 or, you know, non-emergency for those who know about it. Regarding what Jacob was saying around being human, we've talked a lot on this task force about trauma that our police officers go through. And I don't think anybody's discounting the trauma that can be experienced. But the community experiences trauma too that has nothing to do with police, trauma in the day-to-day lives. We've got human services. We've got a huge number of homeless in the city. We've got, I know this is an issue that our council members are passionate about, but we've got a deficit of hundreds or thousands of affordable housing units. So when we're looking at human services in the city, if we're not meeting basic needs of so much of our population, so many of our residents, they get into crisis situations. And what seems to be happening is when individuals are experiencing a crisis situation, rather than being met with empathy and services, they're being we're criminalizing some of these human services. We're criminalizing homelessness. And so that seems to be a lot of what's happening. We're not addressing the crisis situations. If we spent more effort on stability and self-sufficiency, we wouldn't be experiencing a lot of the crisis situations that police are maybe not needed for, right? To help keep people out of those situations. So I also think that some of those types of calls that just get called to police by default, 911 gets called by default, you know, that means that other things can't be addressed by police where we need them. So in the public comment from Bill Richardson, he was talking about unsolved rape cases. I know I had a situation a few years back where my purse got stolen at a public place. The person was found at a bank the very next day on video and nothing ever happened. That's a very small situation for me out, you know, several $100s worth of, you know, time and effort and rekeying my house and closing cards and, you know, things like that. But, you know, there's other things that I would have liked to have pursued that didn't necessarily get addressed. It got assigned, but never was taken forth anywhere. Is that because we have a sidewalk sitting ordinance and the police are being called on those things, on those calls that are criminalizing poor people? I don't know. We don't necessarily have the data for that, as we discussed previously. But I love what I think it was Vidi who was saying it around the ordinances. So we haven't talked a lot about ordinances and what we can change in this task force, but I think a serious look around that should happen. And then we also haven't really addressed the conversation of SROs in the schools and who's responsible for funding public safety. Is it the schools funding the SROs, or is it the city funding the SROs? And how does that work in the overall community engagement? I see the line item here. But I'm not really sure that we've delved into that.
Okay. Thank you, Genevieve. We'll go to Lauren, followed by Rob, and then Keisha.
Thank you. And you picked up on a point I wanted to make, Genevieve, about SROs, because I know in the Tempe Union High School District, I think that almost everyone on that board does not want to see SROs in the school, but this action or lack of action has been kind of delayed because of COVID, since there isn't that much in-person learning going on. but I know that some of the SROs are funded by the state, and so they come gratis, and so that can have impact there. But we haven't even dealt with that as an issue, but we'll have to deal with it as an issue in our upcoming budget about SROs. And so thanks for bringing that up. And also in terms of community engagement, I think part of it has to be, how do we engage? And for many people, engaging with the police is engaging with the police at a demonstration. I mean, in the past year or so. So shouldn't we set up some sort of rules of engagement? And that might go under the establish a community liaison position, because that community liaison person should be dealing with the different groups that are coming to protest and working with them. But I think the ACLU has published sort of guidelines, and I think we need to refer to that when we think about how we engage with protesters and what our values are as we engage with protest, and making sure those values match our values as a city. And also, I think back to the Antonio Arce tragedy, and I know that when we had public meetings around then, we had a lot of police officers in the room. And for some members of the community, that was traumatizing to have as many police officers as we had to. I mean, at times it looked like there were maybe, it seemed like there were at least 6, maybe 8, maybe even 10 at some of the meetings. And to me, that kind of militarized the whole discussion, and it made for a difficult discussion with the community. So I think we have to think about when we're engaging the community at our council meetings, and there's a big controversial issue, that we don't necessarily want to militarize that space. So if we could include that. And just an aside about someone mentioned urination, and I know that actually Rob Ferraro did a study of all the downtown area and who was being arrested for public urination, and discovered it was like 98, correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, but I think 98% ASU students, frat boys, very few people that are in the homeless community. And we do have a homeless court, a mental health court, and a veterans court that bring us closer to restorative justice principles and actions, not quite there. But I don't think people are jailed in Tempe for public urination. Through the homeless court, they end up having to talk to a counselor or talk to someone to get resources, I believe. But there's still the question, of how those ordinances are applied. I realize that I want to take that seriously, but just specifically about the urination thing, I just thought that was an interesting fact that we have to deal. It's not that we know homeless people are much more likely to be a victim of violence than commit violence and violent acts themselves. So it's important to note that, as well as they're much less likely to commit these little petty crimes than your ASU students do on Mill Avenue. So thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. We'll go to Keisha, followed by Robbie. I'm sorry, we're going to go to Rob, then followed by Keisha, then Robbie. My apologies.
No problem. I'll try and be brief. So Genevieve, you brought up some really great points in terms of utilizing resources, specifically police resources, on certain issues. And Lauren, yes, Councilmember Kubi, yes, absolutely. Regarding, I worked in the downtown as a bike officer, as an officer, and as a supervisor for the majority of my career with the Tempe Police Department. There was questions in the chat about, is there an incentivization to write tickets? What's that culture like? I can only just tell you from my experience, and I'm sure it can be echoed by every other officer in this group, including the chief. Never in my life, in my career, have any pressure on me to write a ticket or to write citations. That's just my personal experience. I can, also officers recognize that this entire country is going through hard times right now, and that's taken into account as well in terms of other citations that potentially could be addressed. So, but specifically, I wanted to highlight just because there are city codes, because that's what these are, city codes that are on the book that are potentially enforceable, doesn't mean they are. And we are doing incredible work. I know it's not perfect. I know there are one-offs, but we are doing incredible work with officers and the park team, paired with Care 7 and paired with Hope, with our city's outreach team. It could be a lot better. It could be better staffed. But we have officers that are dedicated to this, that know individuals by name, where individuals experiencing homelessness, where they are, where their camps are, and trying to get them housed, trying to get them vouchers, trying to get them off the street, and they are immersed in this. You know, our park officers have saved lives utilizing Narcan, chest compressions. There is a culture of we're trying to assist these individuals who are experiencing homelessness and who are vulnerable. So and Councilmember Kubi, thank you for bringing it up. You know, urinating in public, we found that it was the majority, overwhelming majority was ASU college students on a Friday or Saturday night. And so I just wanted to highlight the work that's being done with the Hope Outreach team and paired with our officers. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. We'll go to Keisha, followed by Robbie, and then Jacob. Rayford.
Yeah, I'd love to respond to Rob's statement. Yes, I agree that there are officers in houseless communities that do know the individuals named in these communities. However, that does not change the fact in any way that they are still criminalizing these individuals, regardless of whether or not you say their name when you walk up to them to ask them for their name and ID, to run them for warrant checks, and to wake them up off of police, off of bus stops and benches to ask them to move. And while you're doing that, literally just the other day, last night, I need to take a deep breath because that just really frustrated me. Yeah, just last night I was out in you know, we were called for a community situation where there was a houseless individual who ended up on one of our community members' porches, and he was confused and didn't have you know, much ability to communicate, but he wasn't hostile in any way. So our community member allowed them to sleep on their porch for the night, and the next day asked them to leave, which he did so. Later on that evening, he came back, he brought all his stuff. So they called us out, and we, you know, responded to that call, trying to help move this individual from this person's porch, because obviously if he's there for too long, someone in that apartment complex probably would have called the police. And then this individual would have been, you know, ticketed and criminalized for trespassing, even though he was a confused mental health or individual with some mental health problems. And so we helped him move his things to the closest place that he could go, because there are no resources. So we helped him move himself to a bus stop where there were other individuals who were also there, sleeping and, you know, trying to, you know, just exist in a world where they don't have a house. And, you know, after we got all his things moved and situated, we, you know, went back to the place that we were at, which was just down the street, and noticed that probably about 5 minutes later that there were police lights. And so we go back, you know, we look around the corner, and so there you have it. You have this police officer coming up to this guy by name, asking him, hey, what are you doing out here? I'm not going to say his name, but, you know, addressing this individual by name. And while they're addressing him by name, also running his name for warrant checks, because he was dazed and confused and you know, trying to sleep on the bus stop. There were probably 6 people at the bus stop. There was 7 cop cars that came that all had about 2 cops to each police car. And so now you have about 14 cops there to address these 7 individuals who were literally sleeping with all their belongings. And what happened? They arrested 3 of them because they ran their name for warrant checks, probably minor warrants for failure to appear or some sort of trespassing thing, you know, criminalization of homelessness. And they took 3 of these individuals to jail. And guess what happened to their belongings? The only thing that they own in this world, what do they do with them? They threw them in the trash. They didn't even give these people the dignity of taking their belongings with them to jail so that they could have them when they get out. To the police, it's just trash because it looks like trash. But to these individuals living on the street, it is, you know, that is everything. They cherish those belongings. And when we asked the police officers what they were doing out there, they literally said, quote unquote, oh, we're just coming out here to help the community. And I'm like, okay, well, are you giving them blankets? Are you offering them food? Are you giving them water? Oh, no. We are not allowed to do any of those things. We're just coming to make sure that they're okay. And by making sure they're okay meant we're going to run their names and make sure that they don't have any warrants so we can take them to jail if necessary. You know, so that's what you mean when you say that your officers know these individuals by name. Yeah, they do, but they still harass them and criminalize them for being homeless. Okay, so that wasn't my initial point. That just pissed me off. My initial point was to Melody, who had a really great point about education. And as a business owner, her initial response may have been to call the police, but because of this space and because of her experience, she knew that that wasn't the best idea. But here's the thing, hyper policing in our communities comes from being brainwashed by media, by our community members, by Tempe Council, by the city, by our schools. I was having a conversation just the other day about the fact that it takes 6 or 7 to 12 times for something to be ingrained in someone's memory, right? So when you see something, you know, a certain amount of times, like the fact that homeless people are dangerous, or that Black people are dangerous, or that brown people coming from the border are dangerous, what are you going to do when you see one of those people? You're going to think that they're dangerous. And so rather than acting with an educated response or acting with compassion, then, you know, we're meeting these people with the tactic of, oh, I'm afraid of them, so now I have to call the police because these are scary monsters that are dangerous, and because this homeless person is sleeping on my you know, front porch. I'm not saying you did that, Melody, but a lot of people think that that's a dangerous situation automatically just because someone's homeless and trying to find a place of shelter. So what needs to happen is the way that we've taught people to fear these individuals, these Black people, you know, Black people and, you know, homeless people and undocumented people, and, you know, the list goes on and on. We need to now re-educate them to understand that there are better ways to engage with the community, that they're not dangerous, scary individuals. So I just appreciated that that Melody brought up that point, because I think it's a key point to one of the root issues here. I'm done.
Thank you, Keisha. Before we go to Dr. Rapi, Keisha, there was a clarification question in regards to, was that Tempe Police Department in reference? I'm not sure, Keisha, if you heard me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Was that, there was just a clarification question real quick before we move to Jacob, and then Jeff, was that Tempe Police Department when you mentioned all the officers that came to the call?
That specifically was not Tempe Police Department, but I have seen it happen in Tempe. BLM actually has done a survey in Tempe specifically around the criminalization of homelessness, specifically speaking to unhoused folks and what their experiences have been, and it's a similar experience.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go ahead and move to Dr. Rabi and then to Jacob before we move to our fourth pillar.
Hi, Brittany. Keisha, I'm sorry you had to that happened and you were having to witness that, but I feel like it's dangerous to say anything positive about police on this. And I just wanted to speak up and say, when it comes to safety resource officers, we had an amazing safety resource officer in Corona del Sol High School, the only police officer there who stopped an armed suspect from entering campus, where there were over 3,000 students and 500 staff. So, and we also have to look at statistically, thank God this year because of COVID, we weren't in school, but statistically the school shooters are teens, and we need to do something different. We did have community mental health in the schools. We were able to at some point track children at risk in the schools, and I think we have to start younger. You know, we can go with from preschool on up. but we need to be in the schools. And I don't think the police should be the only thing, but I do think that we have to be realistic. As a mom with 3 kids who are now fortunately adults, and any of you who've had kids in school, the fear of an armed suspect entering a school is real. And fortunately, in this case, the officer who was amazing, female officer SRO, who had to write her own paperwork to get grants to fund her position, stopped a armed gunman from entering campus, where it could have been really bad. This individual was known and no services were available and no intervention was done. So I keep bringing up schools and kids, and I feel like we need to make police unnecessary so that we take care of it before we need any of that. So if we have mental health in the schools, if we have safety in the schools, and we get to kids early, like Antonio Arce, I mean, kicked out of school, there were no services for him. And that makes me so mad that we should have helped him. We should have prevented that. But there's no schools for kids, there's no programs for kids who are in middle school or elementary school who get expelled from school. We have compadre for teenagers. What are we doing in Tempe for our kids? I have been screaming about a Tempe children's focus for 20 years. But if we prevent stuff, if we intervene early, let's make policing or policing unnecessary. Let's talk about public safety. And let's get to the kids. Let's take care of our kids, keep our kids safe, prevent this. I want to hear solutions. I want to hear positive stuff we can do. And I know lots of people are traumatized for lots of things, but let's talk about our kids and intervene and get community mental health. But this one SRO saved an entire campus of kids from a shooter. And so I have really concerns about saying no police in the schools, because as much as I wish our schools were safe, they're not. And it never hit me harder than when I was right next door to this armed teenager going onto campus to kill a girlfriend and her new boyfriend. So I think we have to look at our violent society that isn't just Tempe, but we need to really look at guns and violence and why our communities and our country are so violent. And we have to take on guns, we have to take on violence, from violent video games to guns with kids to the whole thing. My husband last year had a 13-year-old bring a gun onto campus, and it looked like a firearm. It looked exactly like a firearm. And they were buying these guns at the candy store next to the school and taking the orange tips off, and it was an exact replica. So if we don't talk about guns, we're not going to change any of this stuff, because we need to make sure police don't need guns, because nobody else has guns either. So I can't let the gun thing go. And I'm not an anti-gun thing, but I think guns are out of control and our violence is out of control. And thank you, Melody. Kindness needs to be the lead, not guns. So thanks for listening to me about that. But it just, the anger and the violence and the guns, it needs to stop.
Thank you. And Jacob Rifford, your hand was up. Did I miss you?
I'm going to need a second after that. I'm not.
Okay, thank you.
Circle back to me afterwards if you don't mind, please.
Okay, so we're going to, Mayor has his hand up.
So just a couple of quick things, and I'm not saying that any of this may end up in the final report that we're doing, but just a few things that were being discussed. One, I mean, I know we sort of talked about the notion of having to, talking about dispatch and kind of, retraining, and not necessarily talking about retraining officers totally, but also retraining members of our community. And I think that's what Melody was talking about. It's the whole concept that, from being part of this group and from a lot of the conversations we've had, kind of realizing there are other better ways to address a situation than just simply calling the police on someone who might not happen to have a home. And I really appreciate the fact that she brought that up, because that's a situation that a lot of business owners in Tempe and a lot of people are confronted with on a regular basis. But the fact that she, obviously knew that that was not the right solution and then did something else, it's just a matter, frankly, I think, of the city government here, whatever, myself and council members QB, Vice Mayor Keating, finding ways to also kind of re-educate our community about there are better ways to deal with these situations. We almost have to retrain our residents from just sort of picking up the phone and automatically calling 911. Because even as Rob talked about earlier in the conversation, the police many times, they don't want to be involved in those situations. They're worried about, getting involved in real criminal activity, not situations pertaining to the homeless. And so I think the first step is really trying to make sure that residents and people who are in Tempe working don't actually call the police when situations like that happen, because that's what creates that interaction in the first place. And we have to check ourselves, frankly, as residents in terms of not doing that. Couple of the quick things just about, affordable housing and homelessness. One of the things that we've learned of the council is that in order to meet the need of affordable housing in our community, the city of Tempe needs 11,000 more units of affordable housing by the year 2040, just to actually keep pace with where we need to be, to make sure that we are not driving people out of this community, to make sure that anyone can live here regardless of occupation or income. And so that's something that we're working on right now as a council. We actually have a big initiative tomorrow night on the council agenda for the council to approve what a lot of people are now already calling the most aggressive affordable housing plan of any city in the entire state of Arizona. Because even though the state of Arizona has frankly put a lot of preemptions and a lot of restrictions on us when it comes to providing affordable housing for our residents, we have to make sure as the city of Tempe, we find creative solutions to do that, because that also, once again, connects to the homelessness issue. When people can't afford to live here, they may fall into a state of homelessness if they're experiencing some kind of financial instability. But we also just want to make sure to retain the diversity that we have as a community. We have affordable housing options for anyone who wants to live here. You should not have to be a doctor or a lawyer or independently wealthy to be able to live in Tempe. And that's part of our responsibility, frankly, as a city government, to make sure that we're providing that kind of housing for everyone across the board. And the last thing I was going to say too, just regarding homelessness, then I'll be quiet. We definitely have to do more in that area. Our human services division between Care 7 and the Hope team, they do a tremendous job. But the reality is we are going to, as a council, we're going to have to provide more funding and frankly, a reallocation of certain resources to really make sure that we're doing right by individuals who don't have homes. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, I think that was out of Wyoming, basically why they stopped cities and towns from enforcing sidewalk sitting ordinances and urban camping statutes was because they basically said it's inhumane to kick people out of a park or off of a street corner or under a ramada if you are not providing a place for people to go. And so the reality is we have to find a place for people to be in the city of Tempe where they have a safe place to live, complete with not just a bed, but the wraparound services they need to live productive lives and to help lift them up. And actually early today, myself and Chief Glover and Councilmember Adams were down in Phoenix looking at a facility that's been very successful in Phoenix, because we're trying to really effectively scout out some of those options in terms of providing true, not just shelter, but opportunities for those who might not have homes to really lift themselves up. And I know that is, once again, that's a responsibility that myself and I know our city council and our staff and human services take very seriously. And I can promise to everyone on this call that we are going to be doing a lot more in the very near future.
Thank you, Mayor. In order to get to our fourth pillar tonight, I'm going to go ahead and move us along to our workforce. I'm sorry, go ahead, Rosa.
Just on that pillar, David Carey, representing, and I know that you've done so much work with communities with disabilities. Anything that you would like to share? I know my work with you, you're so knowledgeable.
Oh, hey, can you hear me?
You can, David.
I know we're running late, so I'll try to make it brief. No doubt racism exists, and that's very understandable. I understand that, and if I told you it did not exist, I'd be fooling myself and trying to fool somebody else too as well. But I think it's important that oftentimes we fear the unknown, and if we don't know something, we fear somebody. And I think we've kind of cut ourselves off from each other, that we don't want to know about each other. Oftentimes, you mentioned earlier how about neighbors, calling on a homeless person who's sleeping on their porch. We build fences these days around each other. We build walls up around each other, And what I'm gonna go to, I know it's gonna be different than what some other people were saying earlier, but I really believe that cops should be involved in the community. Maybe not in uniform playing basketball with our kids, but how about maybe coaching the kids? How about in school, maybe you're doing programs to learn about public safety. These type of things, and I don't know what Tempe is doing with their officers and what their responsibilities are as far as being part of a community. I don't know those things, but I grew up in a smaller town, and yeah, it wasn't Tempe, it wasn't Phoenix, it was definitely a smaller town. But I grew up around cops. My friend, his father was a cop. I rode in the back of a cop car. Of course, I rode in the back of a cop car because he would take us home from the baseball game. But I got to know cops on a first-hand basis. Most cops, people don't like hear that, but they're just like us for the most part. Yeah, of course, there's some bad apples out there, but I think it's important that we are engaged with police officers because you fear what you don't know. And so I'm gonna go, and I don't know what Chief Glover and the city has planned, but I think it's important that the cops are part of the community. But maybe, like I said, not in uniform, but regular plain clothes. They're coaching volleyball, or they coaching baseball, or maybe at the homeless shelter, not in uniform, serving meals. Because I think as we get to know each other, it's really hard to hate somebody And so, and then next thing I want to say is, last thing I want to talk about is the public urination thing. And we have to have. I understand what people are saying, and they're upset about that, and maybe ticket. Maybe that's a little bit excessive if there's tickets. That's for debate. I'm not for sure if they aren't giving tickets out for those, but you really can't have people going around urinating or defecating all over the city. I mean, it's just a public safety hazard. Now, maybe not a citation, but maybe do some community service, clean up the streets. If that, and the second thing, I want to go back and also know about this too as well. A lot of these things, these laws are in place for public safety. And, I'm gonna go back, I wrote about 10 years ago, I think it was, and we worked on a project in Tempe where two of my friends were hit and killed crossing the street. They were crossing the street to get to the bus stop because instead of going from Broadmoor back up to Broadway and then come back up to go to the bus stop, they cut across on Broadmoor and got hit by a car, and both of them died. These are two separate events. Didn't happen at the same time. Well, what the city did was, they were very proactive about it. I went to Rose and Shelley Seiler and the mayor and council. And they did a study over there. They so it doesn't warrant a red light or a light, a signal light, but we're going to put one up because we know it's in the best interest of the community over here. And that's what they did. And they did. Matter of fact, they did it in a very quickly fashion, unlike most government. Government usually takes years to do things, but it was pretty much put up in a few months. And since that day, I think it was about 10 years ago. Rose can correct me, but there hasn't been one accident of a person crossing the street to go to the bus stop. And so that's what I want to talk. That's what I want to. The last speaker spoke about solutions. We can come on this thing for next 2 weeks, and we can complain and we can talk about stories and what happened, and I get that we're frustrated, we're pissed off. I mean, anyone can see what happened last Wednesday, and know that if anyone like of my color or Keisha's color or anyone else on this, we would have been shot dead, and that's no secret. But if we really want to change the culture in Tempe, we have to come up with solutions. And when it comes to some of these things about the homeless sleeping on the streets, I did legislative advocacy for the last 20 years. And some of these problems cannot be solved by Tempe police. They can be part of the solution, but they can't make the state fund housing and fund the housing fund appropriately. So some of these things it has to do with the state services. They're not there. And so as a result, we have a high population of homeless people have nowhere to go. Now, that doesn't dissolve Tempe from doing this responsibility, or maybe, like I said, having solutions. And that's what we're here for. So I hope that for the next 2 weeks that we really spend time trying to make solutions, because if we don't, we're gonna find ourselves back up here again a year, 2, 3 years later, talking about the same old issues. And let's be let's be a role model for the community, and not the community, but the area around here, the Phoenix, and let's be a role model and show them the right way to do it. And that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you. So before we go to our next break, which will be pretty brief, I do want to move us to the fourth pillar, which is workforce culture and wellness. And again, ask the question, does the header make sense to you? And what might be needed amendment? Are there items that are most essential, and what might need to be changed or refined from what we already have on the plan so far? Again, just a draft. Oops, sorry. And I'm going to call on Arlene and then Keisha.
My comments do not pertain to this particular.
Okay.
And in fact, I can wait when we get to a different point in the discussion.
Thank you, Arlene. Keisha, comments about this fourth pillar? Put your hand up.
I think my hand up was on accident. I think it was from earlier and I didn't go.
All right, thank you. So anything that needs refinement in order for us to have support and agreement? I know I said break. That's probably what you're all thinking about right now. Right, Mayor? Okay. We'll go ahead and do that. And when we come back, we'll come back about 6:26 in about 5 minutes. And then we can get to a couple other elements on our agenda, as Rosa stated earlier in the session preview. So we'll come back at 6:26. Thank you. Right, thank you, everybody. We've had our 5-minute break. And if you could come back on screen, that'll let us know we're ready to begin. All right, thank you, everybody. Looks like we have a lot of our group back. We are going to go ahead and it is at the almost 6:30 and we are scheduled to conclude at 7. So I do want to make sure that we do get the information regarding implementation and have a bit of a discussion in regards to that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our city manager, Andrew Ching.
Thank you, Wydell. Appreciate it. And thank you to all of the panelists here. I know a few people have had to go to other commitments and have said so in the chat. So I recognize we're not everybody who started the session, but certainly most of you are here. You have been here over the course of the multiple sessions that we've had. I've appreciated being a part of this. I've done a lot more listening than I have talking, and that was by choice. I wanted to have the opportunity to hear from the community, to hear from all of you as panelists here, to get your thoughts and to watch. And I appreciate and want to thank the work of Wydell and Rosa and Janae in being able to synthesize what we've heard over the last several sessions into a number of recommendations that we've had the opportunity to talk about this afternoon and evening. I appreciate that we don't all come from the same perspective. I appreciate the fact that there is a divergence of opinion and a lot of strong feelings about all of this. But I think that when we think about, and I take very seriously the idea that we can and will move forward and have the opportunity to move forward if there's trust. And to me, having the trust in this process to participate in it, to know that your opinions you were able to express your opinions and that they were heard and that we're going to be working towards implementation, I think is an important step towards building that trust. And I hope that you agree with that. But I also know that it's easy to say that on January 13th before we begin to actually implement. So I appreciate the opportunity to have a couple of minutes here tonight to talk about implementation process and to answer questions if I can. First, I just want to say that I have no intention, and neither does Chief Glover or his staff in my many communications with them about this subject, to do, as has been mentioned, to have a really nice series of meetings, have the task force make a recommendation, we talk about it, and then it sits on a shelf. That's not the way that I operate. That's not something that I would tolerate. And quite honestly and candidly, Chief Glover would not be in the position he's in if I believe that that was our purpose for having this group, and to have a desire to implement and see changes in the recommendations that call for changes in the Public Safety Advisory Task Force. I'm not interested in wasting anyone's time. And in fact, I would welcome the opportunity as we move towards implementation to reconvene from time to time this group, to check in, to ask questions, and to find out how we are progressing in the things that we committed to do in this group. So I think that that's important. I think that would be respectful of the time that you have given to this process. And I think it is the kind of oversight that would be welcome by myself and by the city staff who would be involved in this implementation. And by city staff, I use that term deliberately because I fully understand that a number of these recommendations touch and concern other departments beyond just police. We've talked about recommendations that will impact our fire and medical rescue department, that will impact our human services department, our community services department, and all of the various departments. So from a process standpoint, let me just start by saying, as city manager, as the administrative head of the City of Tempe organization, it's my responsibility to make sure that the employees of the City of Tempe are doing what we have hired them to do. And it is also my responsibility to make sure that when we say we're going to commit to a course of action, that we provide the adequate oversight to make sure that those recommendations actually are implemented and occur, but not just to recommend that they occur, but also then to monitor and to make sure that we have measurements around those recommendations, so we can gauge the levels of our success of the proposals that have been brought forward. And that's where the work that Wydell and Rosa do, not just in shepherding this task force process, but also in their roles in strategic management, are so critical. And having them on board in this process at the beginning and assisting city staff that's tasked with all of this, with setting up goals and objectives and performance measurements that demonstrate our commitment to achieving what it is that we have been asked to implement and to achieve, is going to be so important. So I certainly want you to know that as part of this implementation process, that their assistance in that will be critical, and they will continue to be involved. But going back to how we implement from here, at the point at which these recommendations are finalized and we have the opportunity to know exactly what the final recommendations and the wording is, I would just, as I'm thinking about this, and as I think about it from an administrative standpoint, I can sort of break it up into three groups. One of which is all of those recommendations that we feel are reasonably achievable and should be achieved within the remainder of this particular fiscal year, which ends on June 30th. And the reason I break it up into fiscal years is because that will determine how and where we would get the financial resources to make sure that these implementations occur. Secondly, there would be those recommendations that we would reasonably set out to achieve within fiscal year 21-22, which would start on July 1st of this year. Those are important because in the budgeting process that is underway and the recommendations that are going to culminate in a recommended budget that we present to council in March, we should have that time with these recommendations to make sure that we plan for those that would require budgetary approval in fiscal 21-22. And then the last grouping would be those that we see as more longer term goals that we would then go past 21-22 and into a 3 to 5 year window. So I would encourage, as we look towards the last session, to break up these recommendations in some, it doesn't have to be precise, but that generally speaking, which are the ones that we intend to accomplish right away, because either A, they don't take resources or financial resources, but could be done rather quickly, or that there can be budgetary authority that could be freed up in the fiscal year. Those that would be in the second category, which would be those that we would plan for in the next fiscal year, and then those that have a longer event horizon. So that's in a nutshell what I'm looking at in terms of implementation process. But a big part of implementation process is the individuals. And I want you and to assure you that between myself and the departments that will be affected, and particularly given the number of police employees and the chief and the staff and Rob Ferraro who are on this call, that our commitment, I feel, is unified in that we want to see this happen. And if we want to see this happen, it means that we will make it happen, and that we will endeavor in this process not only to make sure that your time was well spent, that your recommendations that are collectively made here will be implemented according to those three general categories, and that we would welcome continued oversight and transparency throughout this process. That's what I wanted to make sure that you heard from me And I'm certainly happy to answer any questions.
We have a question from Jacob. Thank you for raising your hand, Jacob.
Thank you for providing that detailed explanation. I have more of a general question, kind of relates to you, but it relates to the direction of today's board meeting. We did take the time to include a pretty detailed list of ideas that were kind of tacked on to the end of this PDF that we were handed. As we get closer to the end of today's meeting, we have yet to bring up a lot of these issues which are very much pertinent. And I'd like to know if we can take the time to examine this in detail with the remaining 23 minutes that we have.
Okay. So let me explain about that, Jacob. We wanted to honor the work that you and a subsection of the group did, as well as some other individuals who submitted items for recommendations, additional submissions to the mayor's office, as well as to the Strategic Management and Diversity Office. So another piece of tonight, and again, timing with large groups, was to go through each one of those items. I've not categorized them, but I've just labeled them so that for reference. But we're going to go ahead and invite others to submit as well. And then that will be the focus of our next session, is to make sure that we examine all the submissions that were made outside of our discussions and see what needs to fill in any gaps in the plan, or that we haven't even discussed yet to go into the plan.
Okay, so do you mind if I jump in? So will we then be able to disaggregate the information, since there were some things that I feel that were intertwined with our work that we had submitted? That way our work is represented in the way that we had provided to the office initially?
Yeah, the only thing that yes, of course, but the one thing that I did do is I literally took it word for word. I just made like some reference points so that others could, I tried to start initially to bundle them into the pillars, but we can certainly present them as you had developed them in that format. I was just trying to make sure that they were organized in a way that we could go through them. I'll give you a screenshot example of what would have been next on our piece here in regards to time, is we would have looked at submissions A through B and then et cetera. We have at least submissions A through R, to tell you the truth, and see what needed to be essential to include with the plan. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I do see it here.
Okay, great. So I apologize for not getting to that this evening, but we will at the next session. I think that's what Rosa was going to speak to in regards to next steps, but it looks like Keisha also had a question, perhaps maybe for Andrew.
I had a question about, so you mentioned that we're going to be prioritizing things for March's budget hearing. Andrew Ching, and so I was just wondering, how are you assessing and determining which items kind of get prioritized to the front to make it in time for the budget hearing in March?
Right, good question. That's what I'm asking, that the group, either with any feedback you want to give me today or in the meeting at the end of January. The reason I mentioned March is that the departments are beginning to create what we call the supplemental process. We have our things that are already budgeted, and then if there are additional items that require funding, those are brought forward, we evaluate them, and we determine which will go into the recommended budget that will be presented to council at a work study session in March. I just wanted to give some parameters to how that budget process will work. As I look at, I think there's a lot of, and these recommendations have a lot of merit. I was just asking that if there can be some assistance from the group in prioritizing, as you look through the four major, categories, if there are some that rise to the top and you'd say, I'd like to see something happen and that budget allocations be done immediately through budget transfers as opposed to next fiscal year's budget process, that I'd like to know that so we can respond to that. Yeah. If it's something that would be in, that can be funded or budgeted or prioritized in fiscal 21-22, which starts in July, the budget is introduced in March, but it's not voted on until June. So there's opportunities along the way to add and subtract from that budget document. So I was just using March as the first time we would actually present it to council.
Yeah, I think one thing that seems to be some agreement amongst all of us is around CARE 7 and increasing the resources around that, and removing it from the police and kind of funding it more so that there isn't as long of a waiting list. And the advocacy center, I think, is a critical component of that, because that's where CARE 7 would stand in. And so I think that's one thing. And if you look at the additional recommendations, we went into highlighted more about the CARE 7 and things that we would like to see around that. So that's one thing. And I'll just leave one question I have. I do understand that the city will be discussing CARE 7's expansion in the park. And I was wondering, I think that's something that this task force should be apprised of. So I was wondering if you could speak on that a little bit more.
Yes, yeah, that is an upcoming presentation. And I know Chief Glover has been part of that conversation. We're looking at having that come to council at I believe it's the February 18th work study session. We're still working on that presentation. But yes, in the conversations that took place in the fall of 2020, there was some discussion about whether or not the PD should either bring back or increase G4S in parks, or create the park or recreate the park ranger program. And the direction from council was instead to increase CARE 7 and the HOPE team, which is our homeless outreach team, to increase those resources instead, and to have staff bring back the proposal to see what that would look like. I think that although that action was separate from this process, I do think it is complementary to this process, because, at the risk of editorializing a little bit here, when faced with sort of a crossroads as to whether or not to go to a police-oriented solution as opposed to a human services-oriented solution when it comes to activities in city parks and especially neighborhood parks, the determination was made to go towards the human service-centric solution. So, I think that part of the way that we demonstrate that we are looking towards finding opportunities where non-police actors can respond in situations that could result therefore in less of a police presence and de-escalation, that's what's happening here, I think, and I appreciate your bringing it up, Zara, because I think it is indicative of what potentially can happen in the transition over time between, a police-oriented response versus other actors responding. So thank you for bringing that up, and that will be coming up in February.
Thank you. We have Genevieve, followed by Melody and Shireen.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I was wondering about some of these items. So you already mentioned prioritizing, or at least looking at the things that can be done internally, don't require extra funding if it's a policy change and things like that. I would like a better understanding of what those are for our next meeting.
Yes.
I think that's just a way for us to say, hey, none of us on this in this task force really understand what you can do and what you can't do, right?
Sure, absolutely. And it's sort of that equivalent of, the 8 can't wait movement, right? If the idea is that you can identify those changes that you can make, or identify that you have already made them, it's not a question of budget. It may be as simple as reforming a policy. So if there are things that can move to the front of the line because they don't require any additional resources, then we should move them to the front of the line.
Right. Similarly, I would like to understand what might require, what things have we recommended that might be preempted? And I know that's a legal conversation. Sure. I think we need to understand that that risk around what needs to be done, or what should be done in a regional capacity. So I know I personally have made some comments around homelessness and HRIS, actions for being hired by other municipalities. That's not a Tempe thing. That's not necessarily something Tempe can solve by themselves, right? So what I guess my question is, or my guidance around that is, what are the items that we're recommending and prioritizing that have dependencies outside of Tempe's span of control? So that's what I still don't have a sense of yet, whether it's legal, financial, policy-based. That is one thing I'm still not really clear about. And then the third thing I'm wondering is what takes time. So looking at something like data and transparency, that pillar, that is something that takes money, takes time, but is also foundational for a lot of the things that we've recommended. So that's something that, you know, it's not just something we can say, yep, go put $1 million in the budget and we'll figure something out, right? That takes a bit more of finessing and understanding for the long term. So I know that's a lot, but that's kind of what was going through my mind around what, you know, how we should look at some of this for prioritizing it.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have Melody, Shireen, and then John, followed by Lauren.
Thank you. So I wanted to just put this out there in reference to Cahoots. I think it was Jacob that really put this out as a platform for a model. And I fully support taking a look at what other communities are doing, especially if it's working. So looking into Cahoots, it looks like it's over 30-year program in the making. And they offer consulting and strategic guidance for other cities and other communities to replicate what they're doing and what's working in their communities. So I think it would be of interest to reach out and see what the scope of that guidance is. And then that can help us formulate a structure at a minimum by March to take a look at this expansion Care 7/Cahoots model and what that might look like, how much it costs, what the budget allocation is. And then just reading a little bit further, it looks like it's about $2 million allocated annually towards that program, at least there. So that might be a really good place to start with some sort of template or foundation from a budget standpoint, at least, and a rollout standpoint, so that we can take a look at that structure and replicate it here.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to Shireen, followed by John, and then Lauren.
Well, Andrew, thanks for that update. I'm wondering what we're doing with our partners, because adding more to city isn't always the most economical way to go. When we're looking at homelessness, you know, we should be looking at places like what is TCAA doing that we could be doing, and not adding to the budget for the city, but maybe working with nonprofits or with UMOM that's right outside city borders. But we have partners, nonprofit partners within the city, and people who actually deal with a lot of the issues that come up that we've talked about within the city with homelessness and mental illness. A lot of what I'm hearing is just adding to Tempe's bottom line in terms of adding to not only the budget, but creating bigger programs within the city. Are we going to, and maybe that's not a question for Andrew, maybe it's a question for the group, should we be taking some time to look at our partners and saying, maybe instead of saying we're going to add a whole new program within the city, we actually look and say, is there anybody that we can partner with and do that outside the city structure? Sometimes when those things happen, you can have a very effective program outside of the structure. So I just wanted to throw that out there, because especially as we were talking about things going on with homeless, I know that TCAA has some great programs already, as does UMOM, as do others, that could be very effective in helping people with mental illness, helping the homeless, all of those different groups. So before we add all of it to the budget, just a thought.
Thank you. And then we'll go to John and then Lauren.
Thank you. Melody spoke about Cahoots, and I just want to back that up. Some months ago, I did a lot of reading about them in Oregon and sent the council members information about Cahoots because it's such a fantastic program, much more involved than Care 7 is. So I would encourage everybody in this group to go online and look at Cahoots in Oregon. and what that program does and what it costs for that city. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And we'll move to Lauren.
Thank you. And just following up on what Shireen was saying, that one of those partners we really need to work with and approach and kind of demand more from, I think, is ASU, because, you know, ASU in the area of housing really contributes to a lot of housing insecurity. And puts a lot of pressure on our system. And so ASU needs to be part of the solution. The same thing with domestic and sexual violence. There's been a big letter, a big petition gathered to demand that ASU set up an advocacy center. So I think there's ways that we should work with ASU and approach them. And then following up on Genevieve, what she stated about preemption, we didn't talk that much today about the Tempe Citizens Panel for Review of Police Complaints, but there were a number of residents who were really forceful during the Antonio Arce case to talk about how we need to have more, we have subpoena power, more power for that panel. And I think we need to talk about what can we do with that panel specifically, what is allowed, what should we push for at the state level, and we need to see what is possible and what we can push for. And we also have to think about changing the title, because to say a citizens panel, like, why does that preclude, you know, someone who's undocumented from being on the panel? It just seems like a term that is not inclusive. So we need to think about a residents panel or somehow changing the name. But we haven't talked about that tonight. And I want to make sure we don't forget about the citizens, or the residents panel for review of police complaints. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. And then over to Arlene.
Thank you, Wydell. As we're looking at putting together a list of actionable recommendations for the city to implement, for Andrew to oversee and follow up with us on progress, I think it would be worthwhile to have another list of items for mayor and council to work on. I know that mayor and council have the opportunity to work regionally within the state of Arizona with other cities and towns, the municipal councils of cities and towns, but also nationally through National League of Cities. I think it would be worthwhile to put some of those topics that we need for them to discuss and socialize with other cities that are dealing with similar challenges, and perhaps we can open up dialogues. I think the mention of cahoots as an example in other cities, how are the other cities implementing it? What did they do and how did they implement it with residents? But giving our mayor and council a list also of items that we need them to go talk about and to socialize and perhaps build coalition around.
Thank you, Arlene. And we'll move to Pam Grunken.
Thank you, Wydell. And I absolutely agree with Arlene. Thank you for the comments. I've been looking at this as sort of a two-track approach because there are so many problems that need resolution. And some of the things we were talking about, what could be done soon and what took time. Some of the things that the mayor and council can do involve legislation, for example, at the state and federal level, with whom council could collaborate with other members of the mayors and councils of cities in Arizona to bring pressure for change, because right now some of those laws inhibit our ability to make change locally. As far as the whole issue that we discussed at great length regarding community engagement, it started to feel like the items that were on our list were beginning to seem superficial with respect to the problems that really exist and need to be addressing. And they might be outside of the scope of this discussion, which is based on what we can do to improve police relations. But a comprehensive compassionate assistance program springs to mind as things that we can do as a community, but and I haven't looked at the Cahoots program, maybe some of these things are included there. Undoubtedly, the housing issue for homeless is an issue. We need housing options for workforce, for affordable, for mentally ill, for disabled. We need services for children, expelled children, teenage children, tutoring, after-school activities, including mentoring and coaching. We need health facilities for mentally ill individuals that have long been deregulated to the point that they're almost non-existent. And we do need to look at gun regulations. These are things that are of a scope that, as I said, is probably beyond the purview of this particular body, but they are things that need to happen to build trust in the community. We need to provide assistance in our community that is meaningful and impactful. And whether or not we have enough money to do that, or whether we work with our partners, or whether we work at the state and federal level to enable those things, are longer term things we should be looking at as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. We do have a hard stop at 7 p.m. So I do want to flip this over to Rosa if Andrew doesn't have any other items.
Hey, Wydell, I had
Sure.
one comment.
Sure, David.
I think the hard part for me here with this process is, for example, let's use Care 7, for example, not knowing where the funding comes from, it's kind of hard to really make recommendations. And I know Councilwoman Gronkin just mentioned about some of the things, the partnerships and stuff. So I think, if there was a way to find out where some of the services you guys have and how they're funded, would make it a lot more easier to probably make some recommendations on next steps. At least for me it was. So as far as where the funding comes from on these projects.
Okay. Thank you, David. And so with that, I'll call on Rosa.
Real quickly, thank you, everyone. And just to sum up, because I know the mayor needs to hop off. Next meeting, 27th, is that correct, Wydell?
Yes, it is.
27th. So we didn't get to about 5 slides to Jacob's point regarding the addition. There wasn't enough time to honor the real conversation we need to have regarding those additions. To Dr. Lerner's point, if there are any additional things that you would add to the addition list, if you can get those to us by Monday, so then we can incorporate them and that would be the first order of business for the next meeting. So, and if any feedback, let us know. The last thing is the scope of our work was about building trust also. So one of the conversations that I've had with BLM recently was regarding the word of abolitionist, and they would like to share some history on that they're going to put in the chat, a link. And Keisha, did you want to say just a couple of words on that? No? Yes? Keisha?
She's trying to unmute.
If not, I'll turn it over to the mayor, but just know that that's going to be some reading that she recommended about.
We have 2 screens and sometimes it's hard to unmute. But yeah, I think that it's important for us, for our position as abolition, to be understood and respected, right? I think that oftentimes people, when they hear abolition, they think of complete anarchy, they think of purge, they think of, terrible things. But abolition isn't just about tearing systems down. It's really about recreating, redesigning, redefining what public safety is, And when we look at the history of police, when we look at that, we see it comes from people who were slave catchers. The first police were union busters. The first police killed Native people. When we look at imprisonment and the prison industrial complex, what we have today, which the police are, why they are still typically essentially slave catchers, because when you look at the prison industrial complex, the 13th Amendment ended slavery, but they had the exception unless it's a crime, right? So Black people went from being enslaved to being criminalized. And so that's why police are still the modern day slave catchers. And so when we look at systems of reforming this, when we look at, abolitionists of slavery, they did not try to reform slavery to be more humane. They tried to get rid of it. And so when we're talking about what we're talking about, though, is to address the social problems, to get at the root of why did the person steal your purse in the first place? What made that person need to have to do that? And how can we address it from the root of the cause, so that we can heal that, so that crime doesn't need to happen? Because harm doesn't happen from crime. It happens from people who've been failed by these social systems. So if we strengthen the social systems, what we're doing is increasing public safety. And that's what our position is as abolitionists. And we want to share some resources so people can have a better understanding of what we're trying to do. But what we are trying to do, it is to make our society a better place for everyone, especially for the dispossessed, who currently are the dispossessed are being addressed by being put in cages, right? Being imprisoned, whether that is with mental health, like 60% of those people who are incarcerated have mental health issues, or whether it's people who are experiencing poverty, or it's Black and brown people. And so it's really important that these perspectives are better understood, and we'll share our resources, and we hope that you look in them. We do have a PDF, Why Are Prisons Obsolete? Why Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. We have that PDF that will be in the resource tab. We encourage y'all to read it. We encourage y'all to watch 13th if you haven't yet, just to have a better understanding, so that we really root out these problems from the systemic root, instead of like the surface level.
Thank you, Sarah. And I hope that is a great note, and I'll turn it over to the mayor if he's still on. If he's not, Mayor, are you still there?
Yep, I'm still here. I'm just going to be very quick since I've got to jump, but I just wanted to thank everyone again for all of your time tonight, for all the volunteer time you've given us. Looking forward to the meeting on January 27th. Wanted to thank Rosa Wydell and Janae and your entire team for everything you're doing, and Chief Glover, you and your team for your involvement at the Tempe Police Department, and just, everyone have a great rest of your evening, and look forward to seeing you on January 27th.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa Wydell.
Good night. Thank you all.
Thank you for a good meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Hey, Wydell.
Yes, Keisha.
I know last week we were supposed, or the last session, there was a conversation about getting the contact information for everyone in the group, and obviously the document didn't get shared in time for everyone to get it. So I would like for this to get out to everyone. So is there a way that?
Yeah, we'll make sure that it gets out. I did put a reminder that on our task force webpage, we do put the entire chat, so it includes all the links. But we'll give that as a reminder when we send out kind of the pre-session packet.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you. And if for some reason I forget, please let me know when that comes. So thank you, Keisha.
Have a good night.
Thank you. You too. Bye, Sarah. Patty, is there anything else we can help you with?